Welcome to the Fire These Times, the podcast bringing you conversations at the intersection of politics, culture, and the environment. I'm your host Joey Ayoub, and today we'll be talking to Saleem Haddad. Saleem is the author of Guapa, the director of Marco, and a second-time guest on the Fire These Times. I asked him to come on to partly discuss a recent course he's been giving on global queer literature, which I took part in. But as usual, we ended up talking about much more than that. We go through writers such as Muhammad Abdelnabi, Vuong, James Baldwin, Pedro Lemebel, Akwaeke Emezi, Garth Greenwald, and Katarina Volkmer. You don't have to have read any of these writers to find this conversation interesting, hopefully. We also went through some recurrent themes on this podcast, such as being sensitive to authoritarian logic and the meaning of revolutions. We spoke about how anti-imperialism and post-colonialism can be used by authoritarian groups and regimes, including Hezbollah and Assad. Again, common themes here. About queerness in revolutionary settings, and even touched upon LGBTQ liberation and the Syrian revolution. We also spoke about social construct and how to understand them in context. So that's today's episode. The episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check their website for other methods. If you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabit. Thank you for listening and take care.
I'm Saleem Haddad. I'm a writer and filmmaker, and I'm currently based predominantly in Lisbon, especially during the pandemic. I wrote the novel Guapa, which is a personal and political coming-of-age story of a young gay Arab man who's living through the 2011 uprisings, and it's set in an unnamed Arab country. And I also wrote and directed a short film called Marco, and I have just submitted my second novel to my agent, so that's kind of exciting news.
Oh, congrats.
So that's a bit about me and where I am currently.
Okay, so recently I took a class that you're giving called, one sec, I'm bad with titles, Contemporary Global Queer Literature. And one of the first questions that, I think it was the first question that you asked in the course was like, what does queer even mean, like, to us, to the different students? And I think I responded something stupid, like, I have no idea, basically. And the reason why I said that, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you on to kind of elaborate on that, but also on like surrounding themes, is that I have always, or before it became a bit more sophisticated, let's say, and before I started reading more queer literature, or like self-identified queer literature anyway, I just thought that queer meant someone who's gay writing a book, right? Like there was this linear definition. And I mean, that's part of it. And many people would still say that, and it's not my place to say yes or no. But based on the responses of the students, and the one, I think you had a course or a different class before ours as well, what would you say is like a common perception of what queer writing actually is, and how would you understand it yourself?
I think I think the difficulty in defining what queer is partly why I was interested in giving the course anyway, because I think we're in a really interesting moment in cultural production around queer issues more broadly around the world. And I wanted to take some time to look at the ways in which different queer writing is illuminating these spaces that we would once consider marginal. And like you're saying, I think the first question that I came up with was, how do we categorize a particular piece of writing as queer or not? Especially when we're looking at global writing and the different ways that queerness is understood and looked at in its own cultural context. Because the term queer is a very slippery word to define. And I think in the two variations of the course that I gave, every student had a slightly different definition. I think predominantly it was always relating to the idea of alternative genders or sexualities. But I think the word queer, part of its power is also in its slippery and difficult to define nature. I think that's kind of why I gravitate towards the term. The way that I would understand queer myself is using or borrowing from the queer theorist Jose Esteban Munoz, who looks at queerness as not something that can be achieved, but as a horizon. And he specifically says that we can feel queerness as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. And this understanding of queerness, while of course linking it to gender and sexuality, highlights queerness as something that is never actually achieved, but a direction of travel or an orientation, something that we continuously aspire to. And I really love that definition because I think it allows for the idea of queerness to be transient, and it allows the idea of queerness to jump through different time periods and through different social and cultural contexts. And I think it raised some very interesting questions as well in the class over what you can consider a queer text versus not a queer text. So one key question that I would raise in the class was, what makes a text queer? Is it simply that the writer themselves is queer? Or can a straight writer produce a text that can be considered queer, even if there might not be any traditionally LGBT characters in the text? And alternatively, can a text with LGBT characters not necessarily be queer? And so I think this is kind of the tension, but the really interesting point of conversation that developed in the class. And the starting point, I think, for the books that I wanted to explore in the class, because yes, we are in a really interesting moment in queer cultural production. But I specifically wanted to look at contemporary queer writers who are doing something new and innovative in the field of literature. Partly because I think there's often this idea that only white writers, and specifically white male writers, are innovators. And queer writers or writers of color more generally can only really write about their trauma, or can only really write about their community as representatives of their community. And that's something that, as a queer writer myself and a queer writer from a non-white background, it's something that really bothers me, this idea of being a representative of sorts, and to be judged on this metric. So I wanted to avoid approaching text and writers as guides to a certain community or as an avenue for an ethnographic exploration of trauma. I wanted to look at different texts and different writers who show us something new and innovative about either the world that we're living in or about writing and literature as an artistic practice, I would say. Yeah, so that was kind of like what I was thinking when I was selecting the text and when I was trying to design the course in terms of how do we navigate this very big well of queer writing.
And so, since we're probably going to mention some names and some texts throughout this conversation, can you sort of bring some of them up and kind of explain or walk us through your thought process as to how you even decided which text to choose and which writer to choose and so on?
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, there were definitely some writers that I really wanted to explore because I felt that they ticked all of the boxes for me. And then there were texts that I wanted to explore because they were slightly more complicated. And an example of this, and I think related to this idea of what constitutes a queer novel, is Muhammad Abdelnabi's In the Spider Room. And I started the first week of the course looking at this text specifically and asking the students whether they would consider this a queer text. And I think there's always an interesting debate that takes place around this, because while the novel In the Spider's Room, which is told from the perspective of one of the victims of the crackdown on LGBT individuals in Egypt, while the text does follow a queer or a gay character, there's a question around whether it can be constituted as queer. I think I would lean towards yes, but I think the text itself is very complex and dark and stifled. And I think what makes it interesting to study as a potential queer text is that I think it's a really interesting study of what happens when the horizon of queerness is viciously snuffed. The text is suffused with this sense of suffocation, and it's a very rigid piece of text set in a very, very straight environment. And I think what Abdelnabi does really well is he paints this vivid picture of what it is like to exist as a queer subject in a world that violently rejects queerness, to the point where the subject himself completely rejects his own queerness. And so there's this tension in the text that I think is a really interesting point of exploration. And I think tells us a lot about the way that homophobia in Egypt is so embedded as part of the social system, but also the political system. And I think there's a really powerful scene, where the torturers in the prison are torturing this man, and the way that Abdelnabi describes the torture scene, he's talking about, as they, with every sort of step that they do in torturing the queer characters, their own sense of virality seems to rise. So it's kind of this very interesting play on masculinity. Another queer text that I think for me ticks all of the boxes is Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. And I think it's interesting for me in two ways. I think as a text in itself, outside of the context in which it was released, I think it employs a really interesting and subversive narrative structure, which is borrowed from East Asian fiction, and it's called the Kishu Tenketsu. And the Kishu Tenketsu sort of plays against this idea of conflict as a means of progressing the story. And rather than rely on conflict as a way to progress a story, Ocean Vuong relies on a twist or proximity between two different ideas or points. And part of the reason that he's justified using this narrative structure is that he believes that for the characters themselves, and these are Vietnamese refugees, and the novel is told from the perspective of a gay Vietnamese refugee living in the US, writing a letter to his mother. For Ocean Vuong, he was saying that there's no need for conflict because conflict is so embedded in the characters' lives and in the characters' history, that there's no need for this sort of plot-driven, conflict-driven structure for the novel. And I think to me, it's a very poetic and beautiful novel, but it works in that sense in terms of talking about all of these different elements of violence and history and trauma in these really innovative ways. But beyond the novel itself, I think what's particularly interesting is the wider context in which the novel travels. So when the novel On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous was released, it was referred to as the great US American novel. And there's a certain subversive irony in this, in my opinion. This novel that's written by a gay Vietnamese refugee in a letter addressed to his mother, called not just sort of a great novel about the Vietnam War, but about the US in general. I think it really subverts our ideas and expectations about US history and also the US narrative around the Vietnam War in really interesting ways. So that's sort of another example of a text that I thought is very interesting. I mean, you've read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, right?
Yeah.
How did you react to the text?
I was blown away by it. I was reading it at a particularly difficult time in my life, really. I think it would have been like end of 2019 or something like that. There are like lots of things happening, obviously in the context of the uprising in Lebanon as well. I think there was something around that as well. One thing that I know of Ocean Vuong now, like since reading the book, is that he's a fan of James Baldwin and has mentioned Go Tell It on the Mountain, one of Baldwin's book, as like one of his primary influences, essentially, in writing this specific novel. And I could sort of see that in the way he was, as you said, like there wasn't necessarily a plot, and that didn't really matter. And James Baldwin, well, it depends on the novel, although obviously there is a plot, but to me anyway, I mean, other people can disagree, like the plot actually doesn't really matter. It's not really the main thing that you would take away from most of his novels. I haven't read all of them, but like of those that I've read. And so, yeah, when I read Vuong's book, my initial, it was the first time I picked up a diary again. I don't know, I'm not exactly sure why, but I hadn't written like thoughts in a journal in a very, very long time before then. And I have been doing it more or less consistently ever since. And part of it, I think, is just a realization of like when we say the personal is political, which is a sentence that's kind of both meaningful and meaningless, like depending on how you're using it and who's saying it, because it's kind of, it says everything and nothing at the same time. But in this specific context, as you said, like there's just so much in his life and in his identity and inherited memory, I guess we might call it. There's no point really having a plot, so to speak. Like the thoughts themselves, or written through those letters to his mom, that's the plot in some ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're touching on a really interesting point that I guess I hadn't thought about before, is that the novel engages with not just the history of the U.S. Vietnam War, but it also engages with the American narrative of the Vietnam War. And so as readers, even though we might not be Americans, but we're very aware of the way that Americans think about the Vietnam War, because it's, you know, it's a big part of their cultural production for a long period of time. The novel plays in really interesting ways with the reader's understanding of history. And I think that serves to drive the plot forward, rather than necessarily this happened and that happened. The novel sort of forces you to engage and question your own history and your own knowledge of the world. And I think that's, you know, where you're talking about the personal and the political. I think that's a really perfect example of a novel that does that, using a personal story to get people to rethink and engage with political history in new ways.
Yeah, exactly. And like, so I will probably quote Baldwin a lot, obviously, but he has this interview. I believe it's one of the last interviews he ever gave. I think it was in London, if I'm not mistaken. And he was asked this, like, the interviewer asked him like about this play that he had written. I think it probably would have been his last play, I guess. And he mentioned how the story wasn't about if I'm remember correctly, like the plot involves a gay man who's unable to find love. I don't remember. I haven't actually read that play, but the way James Baldwin replied to that question was, it doesn't matter whether he was gay or not. What matters in this context is that he couldn't find love. And he was, I get, one of the things that always attracts me to him and to Ocean Vuong more recently, although I haven't read his other works yet, and a few other people, although not as many, which is on me. Like I don't read as much fiction as I would want to. Is an ability to, I don't want to repeat, be both personal and political at the same time, but like be able to speak to the specific while speaking about the universal at the same time, like through the specific actually mentioning the universal, or like trying to make, in the case of James Baldwin, he would always say that he's not just writing for Black people, he's writing for Americans in general. And in some ways I do like that's a totally different debate, and probably people will disagree with me, but in that sense he's more quintessentially American in that sense than many other poets and novelists and whatnot who have been called, like, you know, national poets of America or whatnot. Not that they're not good or anything, but there's something very specific about the way he was writing, that he wasn't chewing his words when he was pointing at white Americans in this specific context. He was inviting them in, but not under their own terms. He was inviting them in under his own terms. And I saw a bit of that in Ocean Vuong. It's a different context as well, but there's definitely quite a lot of that. Obviously, you know, Vietnamese American, and in this context, there's quite a lot of that even without plot, as we said, would be played out through his identity or through his experiences on its own.
Yeah, I mean, I think Baldwin is interesting as well, because he's, you know, I mean, he's having a resurgence now, but I think for a long period of time, Baldwin was not, and I think he's still not as well known, obviously, as Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. And I do think his sexuality played a part in it. I think he never hid his sexuality, and in fact, the fact that Giovanni's Room was one of the first things, it's not the first novel that he published, even against his publisher's wishes, kind of shows that he was never someone who was apologetic about his sexuality. And interestingly, Giovanni's Room is written, and maybe this speaks to what you just said, it's written from the perspective of a white American man, not a black man. So I think that Baldwin played around a lot with these ideas of race, but also was very unapologetic about his sexuality. And I think that probably hurt his, I suspect, I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but that I think also created tensions within his involvement in the civil liberties movement as well, to a certain degree.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not a scholar necessarily of that history, but and he wasn't the only gay organizer. There were quite a few of them actually. But yes, I mean, it was and still is a deeply homophobic society, but like much worse than obviously. One thing that Baldwin, part of the resurgence is that documentary "I Am Not Your Negro," which came out 2016, I think, or something like that, by Raoul Peck. And that documentary is really good. I will say that up front. It's very, very useful, especially for people who don't know anything about James Baldwin. But even if they did, because it's around a book that he wanted to write, but he never managed to finish it. And it was he wanted to write a story linking Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X, who he was friends with all three of them. And he was their senior. He was older than all three of them. I believe when he wanted to write this, he was in his 50s, and all the three men died in their 30s. None of them actually made it to 40, which some people tend to forget. Everyone sort of assumes that Martin Luther King was significantly older than that. But anyway, in the documentary, what's missing is his sexuality. He mentions it. There's a clip where he mentions it, and it's actually a funny clip because the interviewer asks him, Mr. Baldwin, you are black. Well, he would have said Negro back then. You're black, you're a homosexual, and something else, I don't know. Surely you must have felt cursed or something. And Baldwin replied, like jokingly, like, oh no, I think I hit the jackpot. And obviously, that made everyone laugh and so on. But I do think he was aware of how his specific experience, like just the fact that he grew up black before knowing even that he was gay, like just grew up black and then grew up as black and gay, made so many people around him uncomfortable, as all he needed to do was just walk in a room, just be physically present. And that's obviously especially the case with people who are visibly otherized, like obviously as a black man in James Baldwin's case, that would be one example of that. But yeah, like I'm sort of rambling a bit, but one thing that I've always found very interesting about him, and he was, as you said, he was, I don't know if hated is the word, but he wasn't the most popular African-American writer at the time in America. And it's part of why he ended up actually leaving America and staying in France. Part of the reason he went back to America is actually a sense of guilt that now the civil rights movement was happening. That's because he left in 1948. So he went back, I guess, in the 1950s or something like that. And that's when all of those, that's when Martin Luther King started becoming a bit well known. Martin Luther King was only 26 or something like that. Again, people tend to assume he was older than that. And he was really able to encapsulate that that you can call it like an existential horror at the end of the day. There was something terrifying in his life about just being black, because he did not know that he was black until a certain young age, like 5 or 6 or something. And I'll stop on that note, but one of the most piercing moments in that documentary, I think it's something along the lines of, like, James Baldwin mentions how he used to cheer on those old Wild Western movies where you just have white men shooting at Indians and Native Americans and Indians, and it's just considered part of the movie, and there's no ethical qualms with that whatsoever. It's actually seen as like a heroic thing, obviously, you know, and all of that.
Yeah.
And he mentions how he used to cheer on the cowboy, like I think Gary Cooper was, I forgot the names of the actors, and John Wayne especially. He mentions John Wayne a lot, until he realized at some point growing up that he was the Native American in this story, if you see what I mean. And that realization, he definitely took it with him in almost all of the writings of his that I've read so far. The basic knowledge that the oppressed actually knows the oppressor significantly more than the oppressor knows the oppressed, or indeed that the oppressor knows the oppressor, that knows themselves. And this is something that I think was really part of his strength, that the confidence that he was more knowledgeable about America than white Americans, that he did not actually need their permission. Because obviously, usually the way it would happen is that they have the narrative, they talk, they present the story, and maybe they might include him as a token, person of color in that story, but it's their story first and foremost. And he was actually saying that it's my story, and through that, it's our story. But it starts with it's my story. He has to insist on starting with that. So,
yeah, I mean, I think it's the idea of the oppressed having a very strong and deep understanding of the culture of the oppressors is a very true one. And I think it works double as much when you're talking about people who are coming from oppressed societies and are also maybe have sort of double oppression, whether it's their gender or their sexuality. I think when we grow up in a society that is hostile to a certain part of our identity, in order to survive, we have to very closely study the society that is oppressing us, and understand the way it functions. Exactly. In order to survive in it. And then I think one hopes that you get to a stage where you have understood the society well enough that you can subvert and change it, which I think is what's so fascinating and powerful about, Baldwin's writing. I was telling you, I was reading Notes of a Native Son. I think that's what struck me so much is he does come from his own position and insists on his own position. And I think there's, and insists that, and you can tell that he's writing not just to a Black audience, he's writing to a white audience in mind as well. But he's forcing them to come to his turf and understand the world through his perspective. But this brings me to another writer that I was kind of interested in bringing up and that I brought up in the class, and that's Pedro Lemebel. And I think that he's interesting. He's a Chilean writer and visual artist. He was born in 1952, and I think he passed away in 2015. But he was very strongly involved in the resistance to Pinochet's rule in Chile. But then after that, he was also very much against, the neoliberal consensus behind Chile's sort of economic growth, and was also very critical of LGBT activists who he considered to be making commodities of queer suffering. So he was a very political person, and politics seeped into his writing. And there's one poem which I encourage listeners to Google if you can, and it's called "The Manifesto I Speak for My Difference." And he, if I understand correctly, and if I remember correctly, sorry, he sort of, it was during an activist meeting, and he just stood up and recited this poem. And I guess it's unclear whether he just made it up on the spot or whether it was something that he had written. But it was incredibly powerful for me specifically. I found it a very powerful indictment of the homophobia of the resistance to the Pinochet dictatorship. And I think that feels so especially poignant and resonant for our time, especially in the Middle East, where he's, I think, and I'm just going to recite a couple of lines, and he's speaking sort of the resistance, the revolutionaries, let's say. Although you would hate me later for corrupting your revolutionary morality, are you afraid of life becoming homosexual? And I'm not talking about putting in and taking it out and only taking it out and putting it back in. I'm talking about tenderness, compañero. You don't know how hard it is to find love under these conditions. But I think this is, Lemebel's talking about this idea of queerness that extends beyond simply taking it out and putting it back in, which is basically anal sex. Like, he's talking about queerness as a vision and as a worldview and as an important part of revolutionary politics. And I think it's something that I strongly believe in, especially when we're looking at, the revolutionary movements in the Middle East. And I think that they've been evolving over time, obviously, but I think that, queer activism and queer politics must be and has been sort of fighting for space within these revolutionary movements. And I think maybe this is kind of maybe an interesting time to talk a little bit about that in terms of how we kind of understand queerness in the Middle East and sort of some of the challenges, I suppose, that we're facing in terms of
putting it very mildly.
Yeah, in terms of how do we sort of begin to understand queerness when it comes to the Arab context? And I say Arab in a very problematic way, because I think that in itself needs to be kind of interrogated. But I think there's, one thing that I think we were both talking about initially was the need to kind of talk a little bit about some of the tensions that have been, that I think were much stronger maybe 10 years ago, but are seeing a bit of a resurgence, which is this idea of what Joseph Massad has called the gay international, and this idea of like LGBT identity categories being somehow alien to Arab societies, and what that means. Because I think, and maybe for those who are less familiar with Joseph Massad and Massad's thinking around the gay international, Massad talks about a hegemonic identity of categories of same-sex desire, and namely the identity of gay or lesbian, et cetera, which is often, which he argues, and he wrote an entire book about it, so I will always be sort of summarizing and simplifying, but he argues that these identity categories, which are Western in origin and emerged out of a very specific social and cultural historical context, are being used and are used to identify individuals in the Arab context who practice same-sex activities, but might not ascribe to these identity categories. And that this, and sort of forcing people into these categories is part of the reason for the violence that is taking place against gay individuals, because now it's being seen as a form of colonization and imperialism when you accept these categories and when you identify these categories. And I think that, my issue with Massad's thinking is, I have some issues with it in theory, which I can talk about, but I think in practice, the way it has evolved is that it has created this kind of binary between this idea of a primordial understanding of sexuality and a Western gay identity, and this binary doesn't actually exist in practice. I think I do agree that we do need to understand how people identify and understand their sexual identity within its local context. That's absolutely necessary, and how people understand their sexuality vis-a-vis their community. Mm-hmm. And I think that, of course, we can and we should be critical of how sexuality and gender identity can align with political and military goals of imperial powers. For example, the discourse of women's liberation as the liberal cloak of US wars in many Muslim majority contexts, but also the pinkwashing attempts by the Israeli government and supporters of Israel. And we can go into that in greater detail in a bit. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think Massad's ideas are important, but they're important only as a launching pad or as a starting point for a conversation, evolution, and thinking, not as an endpoint. But what has been taking place is that this Massadist thinking is now used as an endpoint, and it becomes a muzzling tool, a smearing campaign that happens often by Western-based academics against queer people living in the Middle East. And this is a very, very problematic pattern that has been emerging that I think needs to be kind of questioned, at the very least questioned. I think there are a lot of intellectual inconsistencies with Massad's logic, even at the very intellectual level. But more importantly, there are these huge ethical issues that I'm raising around the way Western-based academics weaponize this rhetoric against queer Arabs. But I think in terms of the intellectual inconsistencies, I think one thing that kind of needs to be pointed out, and I'd be interested also to hear your perspective on it, is that there's this problematizing of these Western concepts of gay and lesbian and trans. Fine. But there's never a problematization or even historicization of the identity of Arab. It's kind of taken as this identity that has always existed. But in fact, that's not true. You know, it's an incredibly political identity that was crystallized at a certain period of time as a form of anti-colonial resistance, and sort of stoked, ironically, by the very same Western forces that we are now seeking to separate ourselves from. But when Massadists use this idea, they talk about Arabs as if Arabs have always identified as Arabs throughout history. It's something that has never actually, never been questioned, or we've never been anything but Arabs in the past. And that's intellectually, I think, a bit lazy.
So I'm much less nice than you are. So one thing that is very important to note about this kind of line of thinking is that it is identical to a lot of conservative politicians in the Arab majority world, like identical. I can paraphrase pretty much what you just explained, what you just also paraphrased, and think of what someone like Hassan Nasrallah once said, or a couple of times said. Sisi has definitely said something along those lines. Erdogan has mentioned that, I don't know how many times. It's not, it's actually quite incredible that so for me personally, one of the reasons why the link is not then made, like, people, as far as I know, wouldn't necessarily call Joseph Massad a conservative, for example, is that we don't use those categories of liberal, conservative, leftism, whatnot, progressives, and so on in the Arab majority world, in the Arab world. And I also think that's problematic. It erases the long history of liberalism in the Arab world, long history of conservatism, long history of radicalism and leftism, long history of Islamism. They have been very specific contexts. And it's indeed, it's one thing to say that those categories are imported from the West, which, by the way, I'm almost directly paraphrasing, quoting Hassan Nasrallah here. It's one thing to say that, and I would obviously disagree with that, but I think it's frankly, I don't know if the word is ridiculous or more insulting or hurtful, that it is done in a context as well where the actual direct damage, because if I'm not mistaken, a lot of that was also happening back when there was that story of, what was it? There was like a yacht in Egypt or something. I forgot where it was, but all of these, yes. So I think you know.
I think the Queen boat incident, 2001 in Egypt. Yeah.
Yeah. So that one, and like those men were severely repressed after that, and it does scare me or worry me anyway that there is a bit of a resurgence, hopefully not a strong one, but those tendencies I feel were always there. And they haven't really been acknowledged, or at least not as widely as I would have liked by now. And the fact that it happens now, when you have stuff like, Egypt as a whole, like the Egyptian government as a whole, and obviously Sarah Higazi's death by suicide, and like the sort of the ridiculous horrors that Mashra Layla had to go through, and there's so many other people. I'm just throwing names like that, but just so many other people, and the fact that by and large, most people who would identify as queer in like most of that territory that we call the Arab world would not do so comfortably, in the sense like openly, they wouldn't there because there would be some repercussion. there can't be a dissociation from that reality and then decide on their behalf, which is ironic because he's saying that those categories were imposed on them. But at the end of the day, that's pretty much what is happening in this case as well. And there's a lot of that. And I don't know if I'm less nice about this, I would call it a form of gaslighting. And if I'm trying to be more polite about this, I would probably still call it gaslighting. So
I mean,
yeah,
it's also victim blaming, right? And I think that's the key issue here. And I think, like, I think over 10 years ago or 15 years ago, or when the book first came out, and then the sort of 4 or 5 years afterwards were very difficult, I think, for me when I was in the Middle East, trying to have conversations about my own identity and trying to come to terms with my own queer identity, and being lectured at by leftist straight male Arabs consistently and all the time, leftist straight male Arabs lecturing me that I should not be identifying as gay because that is sort of somehow a discredit to any anti-imperial credentials or any leftist credentials that I might want to have. Thankfully, those same people who 10, 15 years ago were criticizing me have shut up. And I've come around to the thinking that actually, queer movements are an essential part of the resistance politics in the region. And I want to talk more about that later. I think with the exception of Palestine, and I think Palestine is an exception in terms of why Massad's thinking has remained a very key part of it. And I think importantly so, is because of the unique experience of direct and ongoing Israeli colonization, and also Israeli pinkwashing tactics where, and we've seen it, it's very well documented, that Israel has consistently, not just Israel, but also supporters of Israel based in the US have consistently painted and used propaganda that Israel is this beacon of gay rights and openness, and always in juxtaposition to this image of the barbaric and backward Palestinian and the homophobic Palestinian society. This is very well documented. And I think the biggest victims of this have been queer Palestinians, not surprisingly. So I think this is why Palestine and Palestinian activists have a very different relationship to Massadist ideology compared to others in the region. But taking Palestine aside for a moment, what I'm seeing in terms of a pattern is that you have academics who are based in the West, who are often quick to smear local queer activists and cultural producers as being part of this quote unquote gay international. If they so much as detect a whiff of queerness or visibility politics in their rhetoric or practice. And often this is done to bolster their own professional careers, right? Because it gains them. I mean, obviously there's also inferiority complexes going on in terms of proving your own Arab authenticity. Because you're based in the West, you need to bolster your own Arab authenticity credentials. So you do that by accusing others of not being Arab enough. But I think as well, like, this very quickly becomes victim blaming. Because you queer person living in the Middle East, because you so treacherously embrace the colonial and imperial Western identity of gay, which is so alien to your own culture and experience, then it is no surprise that you were rejected or attacked or tortured or imprisoned or forced into exile. And not just is it no surprise, but actually you played a part in that as well by embracing this identity that is alien to you. So it very quickly becomes victim blaming. I mean, in my opinion, I think, if I'm being sort of, I guess, benevolent, I would say that, Massadists maybe are, it sort of operates in the same logic that Assadism operates, or the way the ideology of Hezbollah operates, which is to say that it invokes post-colonialism and anti-imperialism as an endpoint, rather than as a foundation on which further evolution and thinking can take place. And this is my benevolent perspective, but I think the truth is a lot more sinister, as it is with Hezbollah, maybe. And it's that I think Massadism has become a tool for distraction for queer communities in the Middle East. And I don't want to equate Massadism with racism because I think they're very different things. But I think there's this Toni Morrison quote that I think really works in this context. And I'm just going to say what she says, but you can replace racism with Massadism. So Toni Morrison writes, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdom, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. And for me, I think that this is really the homophobic kernel in the logic of Massadism, because it forces queer Arabs to continuously prove that their identity and their existence is somehow not this colonial, formation, but actually very real and very, true to their identity, that it just distracts them from properly participating in liberation politics or even asserting their own existence. And I think this is something that, as queer Arabs, especially queer activists, it becomes very distracting and very hard to operate and work when you are being attacked continuously by people who are thousands of miles away in the ivory tower. So this is, this is not to absolve ourselves of the responsibility to understand the ways in which identities are weaponized. Absolutely not. Nor is it discarding sort of the idea of community. But it's a recognition that the communities that we belong to are diverse and overlapping. So our own identities and our ability to transform and mold our identities will be continuously changing as well. Identity is not this ancient artifact that you just pick up and hang on the wall and never touch. Identities are we are constantly constructing and reconstructing our own identities. And so it's natural and normal that we will be living in a lot of different spaces and universes at the same time.
So a couple of things. One is not directly related to this, it's related to what we were talking about before, but like just on that Toni Morrison quote, in that same documentary, the one on Baldwin, there is a scene from a movie. I forgot the name of the movie, but like there is a black guy and a white guy. And I think the black guy is Sidney Poitier, if I'm not mistaken. I forgot who the actor playing the white guy is. And they're sort of both escaping from a train, and they're kind of chained together. And one, at some point, it's not really a spoiler, but like at some point, the white person falls, and the black person has a choice as to whether to stay on the train or to fall with the white person. And so the black person decides to jump and fall with the white person. And James Baldwin interpreted this as like a movie written for white people, because it says in that scene essentially that the black person would always still come your way. Like he will still make the effort to comfort you and tell you you're not a racist, you're not a bad person, you're a good person, you're trying, always trying to comfort you. And that Toni Morrison quote kind of made me think about that a lot. And obviously, she talks about, I think they knew each other. She talks about Baldwin a lot as well. So the second thing, which is more directly related to the topic of like Massadism and everything, when it comes to nationalism, when it comes to Arabness, Lebaneseness, Syrianness, most nesses, almost any-ness, those are social constructs. It doesn't mean that people, usually when they hear social construct, they think of the word fake. That's not what I'm saying. I'm simply saying that those are human phenomenon invented by humans, because obviously it makes no sense to be a Lebanese in nature if you're not surrounded by non-Lebanese. You're Lebanese also in contrast to someone who is not. There's always that relationship. But a lot of those isms, just sticking to Lebanon, whether we're talking about Lebanism, as it was called, and then the extreme version being like Phoenicianism, whether we're talking about Syrianism, so like the SSNP today, and those believing that Lebanon is part of Greater Syria, whether we're talking about obviously Arabism and Pan-Arabism, and people who say, the Naserists, and after that, the Ba'athists, a bit of Gaddafi, a bit of that, a lot of those isms were thought about and invented essentially by middle-class intellectuals who lived in the diaspora. A lot of the Arabic Nahda of the past century or so, Khalil Gibran and Mikhail Naimi, I think, other people, I'm very bad with names, those were people who were either in exile or living in the diaspora. It doesn't mean whatsoever that it's not valid what they were talking about. Like, that's a totally different conversation, totally different debate, and people will definitely disagree with my position as I might disagree with theirs. But it's just a recognition that a lot of the people who started thinking about, like, forget about nationalism, even a lot of communism, a lot of leftism, I study anarchism, a lot of anarchism, were people who just randomly throwing names like Japanese anarchists who lived in Paris for some time. There was a lot of that. And it's kind of normal because that's where the center of gravity lied, and to a large extent still lies. And so to use that as then kind of like a what's that word? Like a weapon against people who would identify as LGBTQ in the Arab world, in the Arab majority world, without even deconstructing what Arab world means in this context, it's very lazy. It sort of assumes that there is such a thing as a united Arab identity, and like even under Gamal Abdel Nasser, that wasn't accurate and that wasn't true, and it's still not true today. And that doesn't mean that all of the others, Lebanonism, I think it was called, or any of the others, doesn't mean that they're accurate either. But it's not. We should just be accurate about this, I guess, is what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, what a lot of these Massadists are also out of touch with is that queer people have and continue to be, over the last 10 years, have been very active in the revolutionary movements in the Arab Spring, within usually the wider framework of sort of emancipatory feminist politics. And these forms of queer activism are not homogenous by any means. They take different forms, and the activists disagree with each other furiously, but they are an integral part of the revolutionary movements, and they don't fit into this outdated framework of the gay international that these academics who are thousands of miles away continue to utilize. And it's these academics who have a very, sort of have a stronger voice because they write predominantly in English, because they're supported by Columbia, by Harvard, by whoever, all these Ivy League institutions. I think this is where I get very frustrated. I mean, I was there during the protests in Lebanon, and I know that you were there during the protests in Lebanon, and it was very clear to see that queer movements were actively involved in those movements. And so there was this article that came out, this Massadist article that critiqued a placard that this person saw in the Lebanese protest that said, "I am a top, so why does the government fuck me?" as somehow being part of the Gay International. But likely this person who wrote the piece, who, as I understand, was part of that idiotic cohort of academics who during the revolution decided to hold a symposium in the Egg while protesters were getting beaten outside, talk about being a symbol of out of touch, was probably too busy talking about Foucault to see the way queer emancipatory politics were interwoven and part of the contesting of politics in space happening in those protests, beyond that stupid placard of "I'm a top, so why does the government fuck me?" which anyway is sort of reeks of misogyny and this kind of stereotype that tops always need to tell everyone that they're tops because it gives them some sort of masculinity. There were, in the chants, in the graffiti, queer politics was taking up space, was contesting sort of homophobic and misogynistic elements of the protest movement. And yet, what this academic decides to focus on is one stupid placard written in English. Do you know what I mean? It's incredibly frustrating and completely discounts all of the movements and the stuff that's happening actually on the ground. It's kind of funny because their gaze tends to be focused only on those things that are written in English that they can understand, that they miss out on actually what's really happening on the ground in languages that they're in Arabic, which is maybe not their language they're comfortable in using.
I think we can.
It makes me frustrated.
And justifyingly so. I mean, I have been in situations, or I have seen situations, not necessarily like face to face, but like online or in writing or whatnot, where you would often have people. I will mention the story. I will kind of fictionalize it a tiny bit because I don't want to name any names. And I don't think anyone meant badly in this specific story. but it was still, I think, very problematic. A Syrian friend mentions how the Syrian revolution is also about LGBTQ rights, emancipation, and liberation, and so on. And someone replies to her, someone who is not Syrian, I should say, replies to her, I'm sorry, but I don't think that's true, because most Syrians who took part in the revolution were conservatives or whatnot. No one knows how most Syrians identified during the revolution, and it doesn't really mean much to say everyone was conservative, because the entire point was the revolution. The entire point was people who were also willing to change, were actually willing. The early days, the early months of the Syrian revolution is still a case study, really, to go through, other than being a depressing one. But it offers quite a lot of very clear stories in which, for example, women in very conservative areas who did not want to wear the hijab were very comfortable around women who were wearing the hijab. And there was quite a sense of personal choice, essentially. That gets crushed out, obviously, with the militarization of everything that follows, and obviously the suppression, and then the internationalization of the conflict. Obviously, like, what tends to happen almost with no exception whenever something becomes significantly more violent and more brutal and more systematically violent is you will have these voices erased, essentially, if not physically crushed and killed and tortured and so on. And so this exchange happened, I don't know, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. It's like, almost a decade since the beginning of the uprising. Now we are in that decade now. It's been 10 years now, incredibly so. What that person was also trying to express wasn't to say, like, it's not like that Syrian friend does not know that there is a lot of homophobia in Syrian society. I mean, it doesn't take that much to know that in all of our societies. What she was trying to say in this context was that, for me personally, the Syrian revolution was also about LGBTQ liberation. And if people say, no, it wasn't, then it won't be. Like, revolutions are malleable. They change a lot. And that's why, and which is amazing, as you saw it as well in Beirut, and in Lebanon more broadly, but we especially saw this in Beirut, LGBTQ and queer activists very knowingly and very consciously trying to make themselves present and visible and loud and known, basically, in those contexts. And one thing that it's still kind of engraved in my mind, and I've even written an article about looking at the chants in Lebanon and during the uprising, but specifically like a few groups of feminists in Beirut, and you probably know some of them as well, like knowing that they had to sort of take over the soundscape in some ways. Like, they had to actually yell louder than other people who were also yelling. And obviously that's part of street politics in some ways, because they knew that as soon as the feminists and the radicals, as soon as they're sort of drowned out, then you will have what you might call a sort of NGOization of protest, which we did see as well in Beirut. It was by no means a perfectly radical, which doesn't exist anyway, but like a homogeneous movement. It was extremely diverse by Lebanese standards. I wish it was a bit more diverse in the sense of including non-Lebanese. There were non-Lebanese, but they were not really allowed to be very
not visibly.
Yeah.
So
there will always be limitations, but by our previous standards, which I think is a fair comparison, there was definitely much more of that happening than before. And so part of the difficulty is how does one in general both try and deal with the complexities on the ground, which take time and take negotiations, essentially, like literally. Like I tried my best to actually have conversations with that. It was the second day, I think, when a lot of men from certain regions, I'm not going to be too specific because it's not very fair either. But when there was the violence happening, I was hit and I stayed, and it wasn't that bad. But I was trying to speak with members of Hezbollah, essentially, like at least supporters of Hezbollah. They were very visibly supporters of Hezbollah and Amal, but specifically the ones I was talking to were supporters of Hezbollah. And it's not impossible. It's not easy. It's very difficult. And it might fail like 90% of the time. I do still think that, not always, and I'm not going to tell people put yourself in harm's way. That's not what I'm saying. But there will sometimes be spaces within this kind of revolutionary fervor and everything where you can have these kinds of nuances where you might get someone who maybe doesn't like you and doesn't agree with you. Let's put it very, very mildly here, very neutral language, but might for the first time sort of see that you may have a point, or sort of see that, well, at least we may agree to disagree. And that's, again, it creates a space, but that space needs to be developed and has to be worked on. And part of my worry in essentially, or which I think has been played out and confirmed many, many times over, like dozens of times over at this point, is that online we don't have that as much. A lot of people, especially on social media, we start with our positions and then we face the world. Like we start with what we think we believe in advance, and then we face the world. And I don't think this is how we manage. And I think this is part of the reason why you would have a resurgence of Massadism and all of those stuff, because those are very easy boxes. And the quote unquote anti-imperialism that sometimes kind of gets bastardized as well in those circles, those are very easy categories, very easy answers to extremely complex questions. And for me, they are inherently authoritarian in nature, or they are very vulnerable to authoritarian logic. And I'll stop at that.
No, absolutely. And I think, it's kind of hard to try and find a balance in terms of the degree to which you give this thinking attention, because like I said, I do think that this, with the exception of Palestine, I do think that this thinking is less common among queer movements in the Middle East than it used to be. As these movements, matured, and I think they've matured and grown a lot in the last 10, 15 years. The thinking itself has matured as well, in terms of the sophistication with which people on the ground navigate different spaces that Massadism doesn't allow for. Massadism sort of has this one-size-fits-all identity, and it doesn't account for the fact that we shift the way that we exist in relation to the different communities that we encounter along the way. The way that I express my queer identity when I'm watching RuPaul's Drag Race with a bunch of queer friends from all over the world, like sort of cosmopolitan elites, let's say, will be very different from the way I navigate my queer identity when I'm sitting with my grandmother or with my parents,
Sure,
or
yeah.
when I'm having conversations about queerness with, movements on the ground or people in refugee camps, and all of which I have done. And I haven't been any less queer in any of these conversations, but the way that I sort of related and sort of practiced and performed my own queerness changes. And it doesn't mean that I'm less one than the other. It's just that, queerness as an identity is evolving and changing, and it adapts to, it's always in relation to something else. And Massadism doesn't allow for that at all. And it's a frustrating situation to have to navigate and deal with. And I think it creates also for a very paranoid movement among the queer movement in the Middle East. It creates a very paranoid situation to exist in and navigate for queer activists, especially activists who are not neoliberal activists by any means, and not sort of, are not getting embassy dollars. They're challenging sort of, these systems of power that are tied to the embassies, and yet they're getting accused of being, part of the imperial project. It's a difficult situation.
It's a very difficult situation. And I will sort of just, to kind of close that side of the conversation, I would just say that in the same way as you said, queer identity is ever evolving and it changes and so on, I would argue that a lot of the isms that we take for granted, like Lebanese identity, for example, can be changed and has actually been changed. There are people who study how what was considered Lebanese in the 30s is very different from what's considered Lebanese today. For one, very few non-Sunnis and non-Christians in the 30s would even think of Lebanese identity because there was a middle class, especially a Beiruti middle class that was mostly Sunni and mostly Christian, a bit Druze as well, although that was more in retrospect. I won't go down in that rabbit hole too much, but it's just the fact that national identities change, and national identities. I think we need to question the concept of what considered national in those national identities, because often it tends to be centered around capital, centered around power, centered capital both in the financial and in the literal, like the capital of the country sense. And there's a lot of that. And so that's a different conversation in its own. The relevance of it here is simply the concept, the notion that when we speak about social constructs, we're not talking about something that is fake versus as opposed to something that is real. Because you will have a lot of people, not necessarily people who would talk to me necessarily, but who would kind of contrast what I'm saying now, excuse me, contrast with what I'm saying now by basically saying, well, therefore, the only pure identity is the religious one. Therefore, if, it's a social construct to be Syrian or Iraqi or Lebanese or Palestinian or whatever, therefore, the only real identity is that of being a Muslim or that of being a Christian or that of being a Jew, that of being a Druze, blah, 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 etc. And my answer to that is that a lot of that is also social constructs. Again, it doesn't mean that okay, I will end on that note so I don't expand too much on that. It doesn't mean that your religion is any less truer for you. It doesn't mean that. That's, again, none of my prerogative, none of my business whatsoever. But it does mean that factually, like historiographically, you can actually go through the ages and see how your identity, what you would think of your identity today, has actually shifted and changed, how it has shifted and changed over the centuries and the years. And that's just a reality of being human. And for me, the feeling, the instinct of wanting things to be static is very prone to authoritarian logic. And that's something that, as an anti-authoritarian, as an anarchist and all of that, I try and be very sensitive to. And I do feel that by and large, we don't pay as much attention to these authoritarian logics, even if most people are vulnerable. Pretty much everyone is vulnerable to authoritarian logic. To be very clear, I am vulnerable to them. Everyone is. These are very human flaws, but we need to be able to sort of pinpoint them in order to be very good at countering them and resisting them and not being vulnerable to them. To sort of wrap it up in some ways, usually I ask guests to kind of just recommend 3 books, and as a way for me not to actually need to prepare a conclusion because I'm very bad at it. But since we started this conversation with a very book-heavy conversation, very literature-heavy conversation, I'll ask you to pick 3 authors or 3 books, and not just recommend their work, but actually talk to us a bit more in depth as to why, how they have impacted you, for example.
Sure. So the first book that I would recommend, and that I have been buying for friends at a rapid speed, I've been sending copies all over the world, is Freshwater by Akweki Emezi. It's a Nigerian novel that's very difficult to describe. It came out a couple of years ago, but it's a novel about, I suppose, transgender identities and mental illness, but it is also I believe, a deeply decolonial novel. It's rooted in Igbo mythology, and it seeks to disrupt Anglo-American understandings of not just transgenderism, but also mental illness. And it's sort of impossible to describe. And I always tell my friends when I give them the book to just start reading, and then slowly it will start to make sense. But it's an autobiographical novel about this character, this girl, Ada, who grows up struggling with the spirits that possess her mind and control her will. So the novel is about the multitude of cells that exist inside the body and that are sort of battling for control and asserting themselves at various points in this girl's life. So it's a novel about being trans, but not in the Anglo-American sense of the word. And I think it's just very interesting. And Emezi has characterized Freshwater as 95% memoir. And as he said, that it was a lot of the novel is based on real conversations that they've had with the different spirits inside of them, which they were transcribing in their journal as they wrote. But because Emezi felt that there was no way that they could market or sell the book as a memoir, they called it a novel. But I would highly recommend that book. I think it's just a fascinating novel that made me, or memoir, that made me think about transgenderism and mental illness and identity and, you know, my own identity in a completely unique and fresh way. So that's Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. That would be my first recommendation. My second recommendation is the writing of Garth Greenwell in general, but I think if you wanted to start from somewhere, I would recommend maybe starting from Queerness. And I think Greenwell is not just a writer who, he's an American writer who lived for some time in Bulgaria. So a lot of his novels are set in Bulgaria. But I think for me, he's not only just one of the foremost thinkers around gay writing, and really kind of listening to him speak about being a gay writer has really made me also embrace myself as a queer writer in a way that I was not able to before. But I think he's also one of the best writers in terms of writing about sex and writing sex. And he has said that sex is one of the most complex and densely packed acts of human communication in which we engage. And in his stories, you know, literature becomes a space for him to unpack this act of communication. So whereas porn is a representation of bodies, Garth Greenwell says that for him, writing about sex is about embodiment. And Greenwell's part of the school of embodiment, which sees sex as a complete landscape of exploration of human psychology and trauma and communication. And it's just, for me, some of the best sex writing that I've ever read in my life. So I would highly recommend reading Queerness by Garth Greenwell. Greenwell also edited a book, an anthology that just came out last week called Kink, which specifically looks at different writers that write about kink as a practice, as an ideology. And I would really recommend that. I've started reading that. It's really good. The final book that I would recommend is a really quirky book. And it's called The Appointment by Katharina Volkmer, who's a German writer. It's one of the strangest and most bizarre, but also funniest and most transgressive novels that I've read recently. It's a very short novel, and it's entirely set in a doctor's office. And it's sort of constructed as a stream of consciousness of thoughts of a German woman living in London who is talking to her doctor. And the novel begins with her talking about her sex fantasies of Hitler and his repressed feelings of inadequacy. And then she starts pontificating about Hitler's penis. And then she starts talking about Germans' sex lives. And I mean, she just kind of touches on all of these topics that are very sensitive to the German psyche. And sort of like how, for herself as a German, loving a Jew, and then she says a proper one with curls and a skull cap, is the only way for her to overcome her Holocaust guilt. So it's just a really funny novel, but it's very transgressive. And I think it's one of those, a very interesting way of looking at the personal and the political, and specifically the political and the psychoanalytical. So she takes this character's psyche and transposes it onto the national psyche of Germany in a really interesting way. So The Appointment by Katharina Volkmer would be my third book. So those are three books that I think kind of are super interesting and super queer and super transgressive in very different ways.
So of the three that you mentioned, I started reading Freshwater for the course partly. I would also recommend it like highly. It's one of the weirdest books I've ever read, and in the best sense of the term weird. It's destabilizing in a good way as well. Thinking of, well, the fact just writing as we in the first place sort of allowed me to kind of inhabit both spirits at the same time in those beginning chapters, and I won't say too much of it. I'm bad at summarizing anyway, but it's a very good book. I agree. And the other, I'm sure, are there as well. I'll check them out at some point. Well, Saleem, awesome. This was a really great conversation. Thank you for having it with me.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to get a chance to talk to you and reflect on all of these big ideas that ramble on in my confined head.
My pleasure. Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.